Welcome to this PHR-SPHR certification class Learning Bite. In this Learning Bite, we'll learn what yield ratios are, how yield ratios are used in recruiting management, and how yield rates are calculated. Let's begin. What is a yield ratio? Yield ratios are a family of HR metrics telling us the story of the success of our recruiting sources and methods. For example, we can measure what percent of candidates passed from one stage of the hiring process to another, what percent of interviews came from what sources, or what percent of new hires came from what sources. Another yield ratio measures how many candidates were hired from a total number of applications. But their usefulness can expand beyond that to reflect every stage of the hiring pipeline and source of hire. For example, how many successful new hires came from employee referrals versus other traditional recruiting methods like paper ads or internet-based ads. In simple words, yield ratios shows the efficiency of the specific recruiting method. It can help identify efficient and low-cost recruitment sources and methods. Yield ratios can help you figure out whether your recruiting strategies and sources are effective. For example, you could assess an external agency's service as a candidate source. Now imagine you receive 200 resumes from a resume agency, and only 5% of them pass through your screening call phase. This low yield could signify a problem. You might need to communicate more clearly with your external agency about position requirements, or maybe the agency's audience just isn't right for you. You could also compare recruitment ratios from different sources like recruitment agencies, employer referrals, and job boards to see which source is most effective for you. Yield ratios can be a key performance indicator or KPI as part of an HR department's overall strategy or HR balance scorecard. All HR initiatives and practices must support the strategic goals of the organization. So, if we're going to implement yield ratios as an HR KPI, we need to ask, how does this support the strategic goals of the organization? Many organizations have a strategic goal to increase sales. How does a yield ratio, for example, help support growing sales by 15%? Well, a yield ratio could tell us candidate sources that produce a low percent of successful hires and higher costs. This source could probably be dropped in the future due to its low yield ratio and higher costs. Now, keep in mind, you must ensure the sourcing of a diverse candidate pool for affirmative action purposes, diversity initiatives, and to avoid potential discriminatory hiring practices. Now, by analyzing recruiting sources, we can determine sources that are the most efficient, yielding the highest quality new hires, hopefully at the lowest cost. Let's look at some examples. An organization posted information about new positions open in the job section of a professional community on LinkedIn. During the 2 weeks, 200 visitors followed the given link. 8 of them filled in a contact form, and 2 were scheduled for an interview. Now, we can calculate several yield ratios from this data. Our contact form yield ratio, meaning how many completed a contact form after visiting the link, would be 8 candidates divided by 200 visitors multiplied by 100. This yields 4%. Now, standing alone by itself, this is a relatively low yield ratio. But if our LinkedIn posting resulted in 70% of candidates interviewed, it would be viewed as a useful source for candidates. For yield ratios to make sense, context is everything. Now, knowing the yield ratio in different levels, we can build a yield pyramid. For example, we plan to open 4 positions for software developers. We know that to interview to hire ratio is 30%, so we need approximately 14 interviews, or we know the candidate to interview ratio is 20% for the selected method, so we need approximately 70 leads from this source. Now, for those of you taking the SPHR exam, case study questions may revolve around applying the information provided to the organization via the yield ratios and how strategy could be changed or affected in the area of cost effectiveness and efficiency of recruiting sources. Now let's take a look at calculating the yield rates. In this sample, an organization received 150 applications from an advertisement, 50 of whom were minority applicants. It interviewed 36 qualified applicants, 12 of whom were minority applicants. The organization hired 2 applicants, one of whom is a minority. As an organization, we decided the following yield ratios are most important and valuable for us to determine and understand our applicant pool. What is the yield ratio of qualified applicants to total applicants? And what is the yield ratio of minority applicants to total applicants? Well, first, let's calculate the yield ratio of qualified applicants to total applicants. Our calculation would be 36 qualified applicants divided by 150 total applicants multiplied by 100, which yields 24%. Next, let's calculate the yield ratio of minority applicants to total applicants. Our calculation would be 50 total minority applicants divided by 150 total applicants multiplied by 100, which yields 33%. Now, there are a number of other yield ratios we could calculate, including hires to total candidates, hires to qualified candidates, minority hires to total qualified applicants, minority hires to total hires, etc. We choose which yield ratios to calculate based on our strategic objectives. For example, if the strategic objective is to increase qualified minority applicants, that would be one yield ratio. If we are looking to increase the representation in our workforce of disabled war veterans, that would be another yield ratio. So let's use the same data and let you practice calculating some yield ratios. Using the same information, an organization receives 150 applicants from an advertisement, 50 of whom were minority applicants. It interviews 36 qualified applicants, 12 of them minority, and the organization hires 2 applicants, one of whom is a minority. What is the yield ratio of total hires to total applicants? Second, what is the yield ratio of minority hires to total hires? Please pause the video while I calculate these yield ratios. Resume when you are finished. Okay, let's see how you did. The yield ratio of total hires to total applicants would be calculated as 2 total hires divided by 150 total applicants multiplied by 100, which yields 1.3%. The yield ratio of minority hires to total hires would be calculated as 1 minority hire divided by 2 total hires multiplied by 100, which yields 50%. Great job. Let's try one more. In analyzing their selection process, an organization finds they invite 1 in every 20 applicants to complete a skills test. For every 3 candidates who complete a skill test, 1 is offered a job. Half of those offered a job accept. What is the overall yield ratio for this selection process? Please pause the video while you calculate the yield ratio. The yield ratio is 120 to 1. Now, this example requires a little math prowess. We multiply the fraction from each step of the process. 1 out of 20 multiplied by 1 out of 3 multiplied by 1 out of 2, which equals 1 over 20, or 120 to 1. Now, again, while we cannot guarantee or predict if you'll have any math calculations on your exam, calculating and interpreting yield ratios is an important skill to possess as an HR professional. Be sure to see our other learning bites for more math calculations, such as comp ratio, overtime and blended overtime rate pay calculations, and adverse impact analysis. And again, I wish you the best in your exam preparation.